Hello guys, my name is Kansas Viking and welcome to my review of Avengers Endgame. If you want to see myself and my friend Ben's initial reactions to Avengers Endgame, then you can go over to Kansas Viking Reactions to see our first reactions to that. At the beginning of the year, if I would have made a video about my most anticipated movies of the year, this would have been number 2 right behind Star Wars, because I just love Star Wars so much. We're talking about basically the end of a series of movies, 21 movies I'm pretty sure, 21, 22 movies, 10 years, this is the 11th year of the MCU, and wow, this was a conclusion that blew my mind. This is a very hard review to make because it is a non-spoiler review and there are so many amazing, mind-blowing things that happen in this movie that I want to talk about, but I can't because I want all of you to be able to watch it. So bear in mind if I'm being very vague about stuff, it's because I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen the movie yet. This movie felt completely different than Infinity War. It started off somber. It started off really just heavy, and it was a very big tone shift. I mean, of course, the end of Infinity War was very dense and heavy, and all of it was very, you know, huge and dramatic, but this was a different type of dramatic. It felt somber, you know, like if half the world had vanished, like that's how it felt. So yeah, it was a great tone shift from Infinity War, and I loved that. Alright, so now that I've given you kind of an overview of how I thought about the film, I'm going to go into some of the characters. One, there weren't a lot of characters in this movie because most of them got dusted in Infinity War, so that was really interesting to see the far-flung members of the Avengers that were left interacting with each other. The ones that wouldn't normally interact with each other, interacting with each other was phenomenal, and I loved all of that. Hawkeye and Black Widow were standouts in this movie, especially Hawkeye, because we really got to see the third dimension of his character in this movie, and I thought it was done masterfully, and I really loved Hawkeye in this movie. As well as Black Widow, we got reminded of her past, and it created, or it added to the somberness of the film, and I really loved their whole, or the Black Widow's whole story arc in this, really fitting for her character, and I ultimately loved it. At first I was kind of not wanting the arc to happen how it did, but I really like it in retrospect. And also with Hawkeye's story arc, I also really liked his as well in this movie, and I thought it was just so fitting. Thor was probably my standout character of this movie. He was hilarious, really continuing on how we perceive Thor now after Thor Ragnarok, where he's more of a comedy guy, and I loved it. He was the funniest part of this movie, and I really hope that we get to see more of him. And of course, I have yet to mention two of the biggest icons in this franchise, and that is Captain America and Iron Man. Their storylines in this movie were phenomenal. They were executed perfectly. They had such satisfying endings, and I couldn't have dreamt a better ending for their characters than what we got. And in the movie, there are some developments that are very different from the end of Infinity War for these characters, and I loved that. Captain America, of course, gets a lot more screen time in this movie than he did in Infinity War, and I think that's okay because Infinity War was a Thanos and Iron Man movie. At least from my perspective, that's what I saw. And in this movie, we really get a lot of Captain America, and we continue on with Iron Man's huge trajectory that we see in the MCU, and it perfectly is bookmarked. Here you go back to the original Iron Man, and how much his character progresses to the end of Endgame. It's huge, and that is why he's my favorite character in this franchise. With Thanos, I can't really say much because anything I say about his character really is spoilery, except I will say this one thing, that I loved what they did with his character in the beginning of the film. I think first 5 minutes actually, like a huge thing happens with Thanos, and I loved it. I really enjoyed that story beat right there, and yeah, I thought it was very, very good storytelling right there. The beginning felt really abrupt, and it felt like you were watching a YouTube video of a compilation of the important parts in the beginning 30 minutes of a given movie that you needed to know about for the last hour of the movie or so. And that's not bad, but it was just a little weird to begin the movie with a very fast-paced kind of hopping around from place to place so quickly. And you had to do that because you had so many characters left stranded at the end of the movie of Infinity War. And so you needed to tell us where everyone was, but it felt really all over the place and kind of scatterbrained almost. But then after the initial 5 minutes or so, when we start to get into the heart of the movie, then it slows down a lot, and it really becomes a character-driven superhero movie, less leaning on action for the first hour and a half, and more leaning on developing the story, getting us to a position where characters meet up, and really showing us the progression of the characters throughout the aftermath of Infinity War. And I really love that, how this movie became not an action set piece, but a really moving character study of what happens to people when half of the universe suddenly vanishes. It creates a lot of hilarity, it creates a lot of somber and moving moments, and throughout that, though, it was very cohesive in the message that it was bringing across, and I really loved that. I already mentioned it a little bit, but the humor in this movie, especially in the first hour and a half to 2 hours of this movie, was phenomenal. It really created some levity amongst the really heavy scenes that we saw, and I just thought all of the humor landed in this movie. You didn't feel like everyone was making jokes. You felt like the people who usually make jokes are making jokes, and so I really loved that. As opposed to the first hour and a half to 2 hours of this movie, where it's kind of a character study and you're just seeing the psyche of these characters, the last 45 minutes to an hour of this movie was all action, and it was phenomenal. Like, I didn't know what was gonna happen coming into this movie, but coming out of it, that is exactly what I wanted out of this movie, and how I wanted the last huge battle of this saga to end. The reveals towards the end of this movie were phenomenal. There were several times where I turned to Ben, my friend who I was seeing it with, and we were just like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Like, we were freaking out in some of the third act, just because of how awesome the quote-unquote fan service was. And when somebody says fan service, you usually think negatively, but this was perfect fan service. It moved the plot in a meaningful way, and it didn't bring you out of the movie at all, besides the fact that you're like, did that just happen? That just happened. Wow, I love this movie so much more now, you know? In this movie, there are complex topics and things that we discover in this movie, and that was very risky, I think, for the Russos to do, to put in new things that we have never seen in the MCU before, and they nailed it. They made it seem very normal, and they explained it very well, I think, to where it becomes essential to the plot, to where you're just like, oh yeah, that's gonna happen again, you know, like this thing that we just discovered about is gonna happen 4 or 5 times in the movie, and we're not even gonna blink an eye after the first time, because that's how well it was explained. And I loved that, because after the initial reveal of it, that this is how the movie is gonna go, I didn't even think about it twice because of how well they explained it. The ending of this movie, as I've already talked about, the action set piece, after that action set piece, I was like, well, it's gonna end here pretty soon, right? Like, we probably only have about 15 minutes left in the movie, but there was a whole lot of stuff after the final action set piece, and it was all perfectly placed. The ending is so emotionally satisfying. There were parts of the ending that made me cry. There were tears rolling down my cheeks at points of the ending, and it was so beautifully crafted, and it really made you feel like this was the closing of a book, almost, at least in this chapter of the MCU. The big question is, how does this movie rank up with Infinity War. I think after one viewing, I like Endgame more than Infinity War, just because of the awesome moments in it, and because of how well it bookmarks this MCU franchise. But regardless of that, I have to take my opinion out right here, and I have to say that Infinity War is the better movie. It is much more cohesive, and it balances 1,000 characters in it, and it perfectly navigates between the storylines that intertwine all of them, and it is such a phenomenal piece of film. And I thought that Endgame, while they did very good at all those things, it was a little less cohesive, it was a little bit more bouncy, and it didn't flow as well as Infinity War, but it was still an amazing film, and I think that it enhances Infinity War. And while there are certain nitpicky things that probably a lot of people are going to nitpick in this movie, I loved it, and I think that it ends this franchise perfectly, even though it's continuing on, but it ends it perfectly. And for that, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 in quality and a 10 out of 10 in fun and watchability. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you want to see myself and my friend Ben's initial reactions to Avengers Endgame, you can click the end card here at the end of the video to go and see that. It's on my Kansas Viking Reactions channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Remember to subscribe. Bye!